G'day everybody, my name's Ben Teese. In case you're wondering, I'm from Melbourne, Australia, so I apologise in advance for the accent. Is there anyone else from Melbourne, Australia in the room? Okay, oh well, hello, that was more than I expected. Hello Glenn, wherever you are. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about rich object models in Angular, because Angular is blissfully unopinionated about how you do your models, really. Directives, awesome, nailed it. Services, great idea, and DI and all that sort of stuff. Controllers, excellent. But models, like, you can do anything you want. And, you know, plain old Pojo is terrific, awesome. But, you know, what happens when you actually do want a complex kind of object model? And I'm going to talk a little bit about some strategies that we can use for that sort of thing. I'll talk a little bit about my background, some motivations for this. I'll dig into just some simple strategies for loading data at first, and then segue into adding business logic, complex business logic to your models. Then I'll get into some advanced stuff after that, identity mapping, a bit of memoization, performance, and so on. So a little bit more about me. So I've been a Java developer. Well, I was a Java developer for about 10 years, working for about 15, then about 3 years of Rails, and the last couple of years have all been JavaScript. I'm a software consultant, certainly not a framework developer or anything like that. I basically just build software for people, and have been doing so for a while, which is fun. But look, there's a sad reality to what I do, and that is that most of the apps that I build fundamentally are just about creating, reading, and updating data from a database. Okay, and that's not to say that UX isn't important. UX is really important and becoming increasingly so as a sort of competitive differentiator. But I think that you know, I'd be lying to you if I said that at the end of the day, it all boils down to this. Now, I'm interested in Angular because it lets me build good UXs in a scalable sort of way. But I need, you know, models under the hood, and I think I can there's something that I can blame for that, and that's probably Rails. Now, I'm a bit of an unapologetic Rails fanboy from the past. To me, Rails applications kind of represented a high point for building web-based CRUD apps. And look, this is kind of a sort of lame way to put it, but it's kind of like when you've been in a relationship with someone in the past and it was all good, and then for various reasons you drifted apart and broke up and so on, and you know, for good reasons, you're on good terms with each other, but you know, you'd be lying to yourself if there weren't times now where you just kind of look back and go, oh, that was nice, you know. So, and Rails is kind of like that for me, you know, it was nice, you know, but things have moved on. So you might be saying, okay, well, rich object models, you know, Ben, what are you talking about, really? So I think the best way to demonstrate it is really with an example. So, but I've got to warn you about something, and that is that no directives or anything like that in this presentation. Not going to cover that. So some of the UX you're going to see could be a little bit disturbing to you. Just going to give you some advanced warning on that. Now, the real-world application I'm going to base my work on is actually a Rails. It's based on a Rails app that I actually developed a couple of years ago, and it was for a client. And what the client did fundamentally was they fitted out the interiors of private jets with stuff like video players, music players, fancy lights, I don't know, massage seats, you know, whatever you want, okay? They'd fit it out for you. And they do it for, you know, owners of, people who, rich businessmen who had their own private jets, rich Saudi sheiks. So look, it wasn't exactly the sort of job where you got out of bed in the morning knowing you were going to make the world a better place, but it was kind of interesting, okay? Now, I can't really talk about exactly who the client was, but what I've done is I've ported some of the calculations from this app to Angular, to JavaScript, just to sort of see how it would all work out. So let's just call the app Pimp My Plane, okay? Because that's fundamentally what it all was, okay? That's what it boiled down to. And what my client needed was a way to assemble proposals for when they pimped out planes, you know, to figure out how much it was going to cost them and how much they were going to charge the client and so on. And it turns out that pimping out planes for people is actually kind of hard, because under the hood there's this really complex object model. Okay, so yeah, at the very top you've got this proposal. I don't expect you to follow all the details in this, but just to give you a summary, at the top you've got this proposal, and then it comprises a recurring engineering part, which is kind of the per plane cost, because sometimes we're doing this to fleets of jets. And then there'd be the non-recurring engineering part, and that was kind of the one-off setup costs and so on. And then, you know, the non-recurring engineering would comprise kind of cost items to sort of labour costs to set up, and material costs like scaffolding and stuff. And then the per plane costs, well, obviously there'd be parts that you'd want to put on the planes and ship sets, and each of those would have its own part, and each part would have installation labour, and then the part itself obviously would have a price. And it all added up to kind of this quite complex object model. And perhaps the real kicker for it all was that all of the currencies or all of the monetary amounts, prices you use to buy and sell bits and pieces could all be in different currencies, At a very high level, the proposals would have what was called an internal currency, which was really what you would use for internal accounting. But you could also have this notion of an external currency, which is the currency that you use to show to the client. And then all of your parts, you might buy some in US dollars and have some labour in euro and buy something else in, I don't know, some other currency. And so they were very sensitive to fluctuations in currencies and what it would do to their profits and losses. So I'm just going to show you a really simple port of the app. It's just doing some basic calculations. So let's just say, hypothetically, and I cannot confirm whether this is a real example or not, but say we're doing something for a guy and he wants to be able to park his Maserati sports car on his 747. Not only that, he wants to put a fountain on the jet, just inside it, and he wants the fountain to be unaffected as the jet banks by G-forces. I will not confirm whether that is a real example or not. I will not confirm or deny that. So what we've got is a little proposal screen, and all it really does is it's a little bit of Angular under the hood. It's actually loading data via JSON from a Rails app at the back end, but all the calcs are happening in the JavaScript, so I can tweak the number of aircraft and my calcs update, and the price to the customer is in US dollars, the internal costs are in euros, they were a European company. Okay, so that's kind of the general drift of the app. All right, so let's go back down to ground level and talk at first about how we're going to get data. Now, there's lots of options for getting data, and we've talked about some already. Very simplest, you can use the resource service that comes built into Angular. Doesn't out of the box do much about nesting and stuff. So then there's something like Rectangular, which will load nested resources for you. Then there's things like Breeze and so on, and I would certainly encourage you to consider something like Breeze if you're building something big and complicated, because frankly, Breeze isn't... It reminds me a lot of ORMs in the past, and before people freak out at the word ORM, but if there's one thing worse than using someone else's ORM, it's building your own ORM, especially in this day and age. So I definitely encourage you to look at something like that. But for the purposes of this example, I'm just going to go with Rectangular, just a little open source project. A little bit of code here. So, Rectangular just gives you a means of loading data from an endpoint quite easily. We'll just get some proposals data here. Rectangular returns promises by default, which is a really big selling point for it until they tweaked Angular in 1.2 so that you couldn't actually pile promises directly into views. They sort of had to backtrack a little bit. Now you can actually get an underlying object from the promise if you want to roll that way. Otherwise, you can just use the promise as is. It's kind of the inverse of the way a lot of resource works. The real power of something like Rectangular is that it allows you to get nested stuff quite easily. So when you get an object back from Rectangular, you can then query that in turn. So in this case, if I've got a proposal, I can get cost items relating to that particular proposal quite easily. So you're probably saying to yourself, all right, Ben, well, what's this got to do with rich models, okay? Because that's really what I'm here to talk all about. Okay, let's just dive into some code, okay? So the cool thing about Rectangular is it enables you to intercept the calls that it makes and decorate the objects that it gives back to you. So you can sort of put behaviour onto them. So in this particular case, I'm just extending the object, the proposals objects that it gives me. I'm sort of keying in on a proposals route and just adding some profit and revenue calculations and so on. So that's kind of handy, and it even allows you to swap the whole object out if you want, which is really handy. I'll talk about that a bit later on. But what we can do is, it's probably not such a good idea of just putting it in a service like this, because it's not going to scale up that well as things get more complicated. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another module dedicated to model mix-ins per se, and just create a simple proposal service, but it's not really a stateless service in any sense. It's really just intended to decorate some of these objects that come back from Rectangular. We'll put the data there, so we can then use that in sort of a mix-in sort of fashion and mix it into the object that Rectangular gives us back. So then the next question is, well, what about nested models? Because it's all good to do these at one levels, but this is quite a complex set of calculations. And if we were to do it back in our proposal service, we'd have to decorate the recurring engineering stuff and then the non-recurring stuff and all the currencies and blah, blah, blah. So what I found is a useful pattern is really to just say, let's get the mix-in to do it itself. We put a method on the mix-in, we'll call it mix-into, and it can therefore mix itself into an object. And if you adopt that sort of pattern, you can apply it recursively. So if we go back to our now sort of model mix-in, it's got this mix-into method, so to speak, and then it will recursively call recurring engineering, get it to mix its business logic into the recurring engineering JSON, the JSON substructure you've got back, and so forth. And what I found is that this really simple pattern enables you to take kind of a complex object model like this and basically convert it into just a really simple set of models. okay, which I'm kind of used to looking at because I come from Rails land, and these can be tested in isolation. You can test the business logic in isolation, however you want to do. And it also, once you've done something like this, it also opens up the possibility for you to start to do some kind of more object-oriented things. So it's not that object orientation isn't always the best way to do everything, but for modelling certain real-life situations, it's not a bad choice, and I think this particular example wasn't a bad choice. One concept that I'm going to talk about is identity maps. Okay, so who here knows what an identity map is? A few well, Ward's put his hand up. Probably because I'm guessing Breeze would have something akin to an identity map inside of it, or at least one, probably a couple, and you can control them. And fundamentally, an identity map is just something that lets you map some sort of class description per se. Although I'm reluctant to use the word class because the mixin example that I've given so far doesn't mess with prototypes or anything like that. It just takes the objects that you've been given, but enables you to mix to put some sort of identity, some sort of business mixin into a map and map its ID and class to an actual object instance. And that's useful if we go back to this notion of a proposal, because we've got currencies, and I've flagged them in red all through this proposal. If I want to mess with, say, the value of the US dollar in relation to the euro and see what it does to my proposal, it's really important that I only have one US dollar object, and all of the monetary amounts that refer to that US dollar should all refer to the same object. If they don't, then I'm not really going to be able to do that calculation very easily. So I'll just reiterate one more time, an identity map, just a simple map, maps some sort of mix-in descriptor and an ID to an object instance. I'm going to use it for currencies in this particular case, but I can use it for other sorts of reference data as well. For example, departments. Identity maps make reference checks quite easy in your business logic, so you can compare things and be confident that a simple equality check will work just fine. So if we go back to our example, you'll see here I've got a list of currencies up here, US dollars and euros. Those have been loaded from a separate endpoint. Probably 0.5 euros to the US dollars, not particularly good. So I'm just going to take it up to, what is it actually? What is the exchange rate? Would 1.2 be sufficient? So having changed that in one place, my values will update, and I get a feel for how currency fluctuations, and this data is loaded from two completely separate places, will affect my proposal. So under the hood, what does that look like? Well, it's easy enough to create a service called an identity map. It's nothing really much to it. It just is a map that you look something up in it. If what's in there, if there's something already in there that has a particular class and ID, then it will return that instance, maybe update its values, but basically return that instance. If it's not already in there, then it will put it in there, okay? So, as I mentioned earlier, REST Angular's got this cool thing where you can actually just completely replace the object that gets returned, and identity maps are useful in this case. We'll get our money mix in. We'll make it that instead of just mixing currency behaviour into the currency object, we'll just use the identity map to check if we've loaded this currency before, and if so, then we'll override it, basically. Similar thing with our RESTful endpoint that loaded all the currencies, all the data that was displayed in the little drop-down at the top. We can use this notion of a mix-in and an identity map just to decorate the data that comes back, and also to ensure that the same object instance is always used. All right, so I'm going to talk about just a couple of other cool things that using object models it kind of makes it easier to do. And I think perhaps one concept is just the notion of the uniform access principle. Now, look, a lot of people will say, well, look, a lot of this stuff's already in Ember. Why don't you just use Ember? Well, I don't want to use Ember, damn it. I want to use Angular. I like directives. And to be perfectly honest, most of my time, all this stuff's great, but most of my time I am actually really building UIs, and I'm messing around in controllers and so on. And that's where I find the power of Angular is, with directives and controllers and stuff. But it is still useful to have a good, rich object model. Uniform access principle, if you haven't heard of it before, it's just the notion that it can be quite useful in rich object models to not have to distinguish between whether you're calling something as a model, as a property, or whether you're calling it as a method. In this particular case, it was really handy, and we can put in a simple implementation just using JavaScript getter functions, basically. So I've just whacked a couple in here, so now I don't really, having put those in, I don't really need to say that my revenue is a method anymore. It's really just a property and so on. I think this will work in most browsers, maybe not IE 8 and earlier, okay? Unfortunately, the only catch with this is if you want to use a The declarative object literal syntax for declaring getters, that doesn't work well if you're just trying to mix it into other objects. So I've had to just create a little service that supports that and will actually copy the getter functions across rather than trying to evaluate the property and copy that across. But otherwise, that's a pretty easy strategy for making your code much more readable. And it certainly was handy in the case of this proposal, because oftentimes I'd have a cost, and I wouldn't know whether it was computed, and sometimes they were data, and that was loaded from the back end. Sometimes it was computed, and I just got sick of having to worry about whether something was a method or whether it was a property. I did some meta programming to sum up totals of attributes, and I didn't want to have to worry about whether something I was trying to sum up was actually a function that I needed to evaluate first, or whether it was just a property that I could use straight away. This sort of thing makes it really easy to not have to worry about that sort of stuff. Next thing I'm going to talk about is memoization, because it's really easy to get blasé, especially when you start using property function getters and stuff like that. It's really easy to get blasé about performance, but if you are doing complex calculations under the hood and you are binding directly to those methods or now properties in your UI, you're kind of at risk of violating sort of a very fundamental Angular performance rule, and that is that your watch expressions should not take very long to evaluate at all. Okay? And one strategy that you can use to avoid recalculating everything every time that you iterate over the watch list during a single digest cycle, which will just rapidly get out of hand, one easy strategy you can use is memoization. So for those who don't know, memoization is just the process of decorating a function so that, or a method so that if you call it and it hasn't been called before, then it will just do its thing and compute, but then it will store the value. If you call it again, it'll just return the stored value and won't recompute. And that can be a really handy strategy. Frameworks like _JS and Lodash give you a mechanism for decorating functions in that way really easily. So here's an example of memoization in action. Here we've got, in order to get this to work, I must confess I have introduced a base mixin. It's not a base class, but it is a base mixin. I know some people get really upset about that sort of thing, but there comes a point where you've got to start doing this. And all we have to do is just nominate the properties that we want to memoize, effectively. So, and their values will just be stored and so on and returned, and there's no need to recompute everything. So, for example, if I'm displaying revenue and profit, I need revenue to also calculate profit, but there's no point in me calculating revenue twice. That's a really straightforward example. The only issue with memoization is that at some stage you need to unmemoize, okay? Because the user may have made a change that requires the calculations to actually happen all over again. Now, the best strategy that I've been able to come up with is really just to, whenever a change occurs, just manually say to the proposal, I want you to unmemoize, okay? So really what I do want to do is I do want to unmemoize on each digest cycle, but I only want to memoize for each loop over the watch list during the digest cycle. What would be really nice, and I haven't been able to find a way to do this, is to get a notification, and I mean a single notification, when a digest cycle gets kicked off, because then I could sort of just globally just say, this proposal, I want the whole thing to be unmemoized. But I haven't been able to find a way to do that. I'm going to put myself out there and say, if anybody does know a way, come and see me afterwards, set me straight. I'd love to know about it. Okay, and just one notification, because I know there's ways you can get notified of each loop over the watch list, but I just want one notification. But the thing is, memoization will get you a long way, speaking from experience, but I do know that it won't get you all the way. You're still recomputing things on every digest cycle, potentially. So what you've really got to do in that case is introduce this notion of computed properties. And they kind of take a bottom-up approach, whereas what I've done so far is computing from the top down. Computed properties are properties that only recompute themselves when their dependencies change. Okay? So only if the user really tweaks something does the property get tweaked. What I've been able to do so far is get a simple implementation into the code that I've done, and it looks a little bit like this. I've just got like a computed property section. It declares the properties, a little bit more complex than normal. There's a function at the start, just as per normal, but I also include a couple of watch expressions. And so what it can do is automatically watch those properties, check if their values change, and recompute them effectively. And Ember does this sort of thing as well with a slightly simpler syntax. There are some kind of complicating factors with Angular just relating to, well, where do the watches live? Because a lot of work has been done out there in Angular already on computer properties, but often it's done in controllers, sometimes in services. You can just pile watches onto the root scope if you want, but there's going to obviously be memory issues if you've got a really big, you don't want to watch a bazillion things. I mean, there's a fundamental trade-off here between time-space trade-off between the size of the watch list and reducing computations, but you don't want to watch everything. So there's a couple of issues related to it, but I have made some progress, and I think it's kind of promising. That said, porting my complex app to it, I had a bit of luck, but I I did bounce off the hedge a little bit, but I do think there's definitely some promise in that space. And again, if anyone wants to talk about it afterwards, I'd love to hear about it. So let's wrap this up. Okay, so I think that I've sort of been able to demonstrate that, well, you may not all be able to have your own private jet, but there's definitely some scope for you to have your own rich object models in your apps if it's appropriate for what you're building. And I definitely encourage you to investigate the possibilities. We talked about a few things like identity maps and so on and how they can help you, and also some performance strategies to make sure that your computations don't blow out performance in your app. So thank you very much and enjoy the remainder of the conference. Cheers.